Attention and perception. Everyday experience creates the illusion that our perceptual systems are omniscient. We see everything before us that is visible, hear everything within earshot, feel everything we touch, etc. But research actually has revealed how inaccurate this view is. Our sensory systems do not automatically and continuously capture the entire sensory world in the same way that for example, video camera captures an entire visual scene here in the 21st century, or a microphone records all audible sounds. And while you are reading, for example, you are probably not aware of a multitude of sensory events: the touch of your elbow on the table as you read, the distant rumble of traffic outside the house or the apartment, other voices in the building, or the rustle of the wind outside the window. A moment's pause is needed in order to bring these other sensations into consciousness. In order to see, you must look. To hear, you must listen. To feel, you must touch. To smell, you must sniff. What happens when you do not look, or listen, or touch, and so on? Most of the available information is lost. Your opportunity to take it in has passed. Perception is a mental act which is initiated by a prompt either from the outside world, when a new stimulus such as the bark of a dog presents itself, or from inside the brain itself, when a task that you are performing requires specific information from the outside world, such as a check for other road users when emerging from a road junction. And we call this act of selection paying attention. Perception always involves selection or attention in some form or another, as will become clear in this. It can involve selection over space, so that only sensory signals from a particular location or direction are subjected to analysis. And if you're reading a text message on your cell phone while walking along the street, for instance, you may be oblivious to the person in full view right in front of you, or perhaps also transfixed by their phone. Of course, one need only use their peripheral vision for that, of course. But, of course, you perhaps might be oblivious to the person in full view right in front of you who's on a collision course with you. Attention can also involve a focus on one sensory modality to the exclusion of others. You may be so engrossed in the latest text message from a friend that you do not hear the sound of the cyclist rapidly closing in on you from behind, even when the sound their bell. Finally, selection can occur over time when you are expecting an event to occur in the near future. Imagine that you have stopped at a red traffic signal waiting for the green light, which signals you to proceed across a road junction. When the amber signal appears, you can focus attention ready for the imminent appearance of the green signal and so proceed with minimal delay. Given this diversity in the forms of attention, it may not be surprising to learn that there is no single thing in the brain called attention, despite the subjective impression that it is a unitary mechanism. The act of attention relies on a number of distinct processes, and before we discuss some of those, it is worth spending some considerable time considering why perception must be so selective. Why not simply process everything that impinges on the sensory systems and decide afterwards what to do with it? Of course, what are the implications of research on attention for people who use mobile phones while driving? Of course, the need for selectivity in perception is that there are two general explanations of the need for attention in perceptual processing, which are not mutually exclusive. One is based on physiological constraints, and the other is based on processing constraints. Concerning physiological constraints, and of course, then we also have processing constraints as well. We have what's called modal attention, which is selectivity in sensory processing, which is based on the modality in which incoming information is delivered. We can have manifestations of attention. The functional goals of the sensory systems discussed center on the detection and recognition of perceptual features, objects, and events. So the different manifestations of attention serve in order to focus processing resources on specific features, objects, or events. The classic boxes and arrows model of information processing that was first proposed by Broadbent in 1958. For example, you see the sensory systems provide a continuous stream of messages about the state of external world to a limited capacity information processing channel. Messages are selected for processing by a filter, and in Broadbent's model, the messages were selected on the basis of their physical attributes. And of course, there were results of an experiment to test whether it is possible to selectively attend to one sensory modality in a reaction time task. Responses were faster, for example, left-handed, when the stimulus appeared in an expected sensory modality than when it appeared in an unexpected modality. The difference is due to a cost for the unexpected modality, not benefit in the expected modality. Responses in the latter were no faster than when there was no expectation at all. And of course, we also have other manifestations of attention. We talked about modal attention. Now we're going to go to spatial attention, which, for example, in spatial attention cue, we have a stimulus that alerts an experimental participant to the possible location of future stimuli. The cue is valid if it correctly predicts the location of the second stimulus, and it is considered invalid if it is incorrect. And so we have cued or uncued reaction times. And, of course, then inhibition of return, or IOR, which is an effect in attention whereby responses are slower to a previously cued location than to an uncued location. The inhibition of return occurs about 250 milliseconds after cue presentation. And then there is what's called time-related or temporal attention. Rapid Serial Visual Presentation, or RSVP, is an experimental procedure involving rapid sequential presentations of simple stimuli such as letters, digits, and words. At the same location, the participant is instructed to report each presentation of a designated target item, specific letter, digit, or sequence of letters or digits. Then we have what's called the attentional blink. Once the participant detects a target item in a rapidly presented sequence of digits, another target is unlikely to be detected if it occurs 200 to 400 milliseconds later. Of course, we have an effect in RSVP and rapid serial visual presentation and the experiments that are conducted thereof, whereby items that appear shortly after other targets tend to be overlooked or simply just not even seen at all. Then there's feature search. Feature search is an experimental procedure in which the participant is shown an array of items, patterns such as letters, lines, gradings, etc., on which may or may not contain an odd one out, or what we would consider in a box and scatter plot, an outlier, a target item that is different from all others in terms of a simple feature such as a color or orientation. The participant is required to report whether the target is present or absent. In conjunction search, the same experimental procedure as for feature search occurs, except that the target item is defined by a conjunction of features, such as a specific combination of color and orientation. And then we have FIT, or FIT, Feature Integration Theory, which is a theory proposed by Anne Treisman and colleagues in order to explain why conjunction searches are more difficult than feature searches. The former, the conjunction searches, involves effort for attentive processing, while the latter involves automatic pre-attentive processing. Think of some real-world examples in which scene gist can be a help or a hindrance during a search task. Object-based attention. In multiple object tracking, or MOT, an experimental procedure to study object-based attention, the participant views an animation in which simple shapes move randomly around a computer screen. While trying to keep track of a small number of shapes, results show that only 4 or fewer items can be tracked simultaneously. Research has shown that magicians manipulate people's attention while performing their tricks. For example, people tend to look where the magician is looking, so the magician can direct people's attention towards the illusion and away from their sleight of hand. Unlikely as it may seem, multiple object tracking tasks are currently used as part of the training regime in many professional sports in order to keep athletes mentally alert. And we have what's called object files theory, which is a theory that explains object-based attention, which involves the creation in the brain of a notional file for each attended object, which is updated over time in order to keep track of changes in the object. It is similar to the visual index theory of object-based attention. And, of course, there's the experimental paradigm to study multiple object tracking. And then, of course, there's orientation tuning curves derived from single-cell recordings in 3 areas of primate visual cortex, with and without attention. Attention is multifaceted and intimately linked with sensory processing and all the modalities, guiding processes and influencing stimulus interpretation. The underlying neural modulation signals reach deep into the earliest levels of sensory analysis in the cortex, from the higher order circuits in the frontal and parietal cortices. A key feature of attention is selectivity in processing. Modern research has been preoccupied with two major theoretical dichotomies, one involving early versus late selection models, and the other involving serial versus parallel selection models. While dichotomies serve a very useful purpose in driving binary A versus B experimental predictions, results and their interpretation rarely allow just one unequivocal winner to be declared. Such is the case in attention research. Attentional processes are too diverse and complex to be explained by simple dichotomous distinctions. Recent models of attentional selectivity tend to incorporate elements from both sides of the earlier dichotomies, perhaps adding other distinctions such as selective and non-selective pathways in guided search theory. Recent research has also begun to explore the way that emotion guides attentional selection of sensory stimuli. For example, some asked participants who were fearful of snakes but not spiders, or vice versa, to find feared objects in a visual search task. Search performance was better for feared targets than for non-feared targets, suggesting enhanced attention to emotionally provocative stimuli. Neuroimaging research also supports the idea that emotional attention can modify perception. Another theme of recent work is to study attention in real life using complex natural stimuli rather than highly simplified laboratory stimuli, such as breast cancer screening and airport security scans. The sensory systems do not automatically capture all of the information that is available in the sensory world. Instead, they select only the information that is most useful to the task at hand or potentially important for survival. The need for selectivity in perception. Perception is selective because the brain is energy-starved and cannot process all the sensory information that it receives all at once like a computer can, or that of a robot or an AI. But the problem of interpreting incoming signals is too difficult to solve in bottom-up fashion and requires top-down control in order to guide processing towards a solution. We have certain varieties of attention. Processing resources can be focused on the basis of sensory modality, spatial location, time of occurrence, stimulus features, and objects and events. Neural substrates of attention. There are two neural circuits in frontotemporal cortex that are crucial for attentional control of processing. The dorsal system controls goal-directed or top-down attention, and the ventral system controls stimulus-driven or bottom-up attention. Signals from these systems can influence neural activity at the lowest levels of processing in the sensory cortex. And of course, many people are going to talk about consciousness and perception. Maybe we'll end on that. To perceive is to be aware of the world. Conscious experiences of the mass of sensations, events, objects, and scenes that constantly bombard our sensory systems all our waking life are definitive aspects of perception. Some researchers have argued that attention is a requirement of conscious perception, as indicated at the start. Certainly, some of the research mentioned points in that direction. For instance, the phenomenon of inattentional blindness indicates that if you do not attend to a stimulus, it is not consciously perceived and is not available for cognitive processing. There is an assumption, often left implicit, that attention and consciousness play a causal role in decision-making and behavior. In other words, paying conscious attention causes behavior to occur as a direct consequence of that mental act. If we feel hungry, we attend to food. We find the readiest looking apple in the fruit basket, then we pick it up and eat it. But there is a paradox hiding in this causal account of attention and consciousness. The traditional philosophical view is that mind and brain are fundamentally different in kind and that one cannot be reduced to the other. This account of consciousness is called Cartesian dualism, named after the French philosopher René Descartes. He believed that the dual spiritual and mental worlds communicate with each other through the pineal gland. However, we know now that this small organ, which lies deep in the brain next to the thalamus, secretes melatonin in response to signals from the eye and so controls the body's diurnal rhythm. Most scientists now, however, believe that consciousness is inextricably connected to neural activity. The psychophysical methods described throughout the book are based on the assumption, psychophysical linking hypothesis, that changes in perception map onto changes in neural responses. So, in principle, for every change in attentional state or conscious awareness, one can define a parallel change in neural activity. And so we basically are our brain, and what we think and know and experience is all goes all the way down to neural activity, even conscious awareness. Large swathes of the brain are intimately linked with mental events in a highly specific manner. A neural correlate of consciousness, or NCC, can be defined as the minimal set of neuronal events that gives rise to a specific aspect of a conscious percept. Neuroscientists have established a large number of NCCs, or again, that's neural correlate of consciousness, many of which are described. Consciousness research has tended to focus largely on sensory experiences, or qualia, defined. For example, for instance, perception. Perception of motion is closely associated with activity in the mid-temporal area of the cortex, or the MT, as indicated by the results of neuroimaging experiments, single-unit recordings, and clinical case studies of motion blindness, or akinetopsia. NCCs are inconsistent with Cartesian dualism, but as with all correlations, they cannot tell us about causation. Is consciousness causal in the sense that it drives our decisions and behaviors? Mental causation implies that at least some decisions or behaviors would be impossible without consciousness. A number of theories have proposed causal functions for consciousness. For example, some argue that consciousness functions as the glue that binds together disparate pieces of information in the brain. Others propose that it serves to resolve the computation or competition between alternative internal representations, and others claim that consciousness allows us to understand what other people are thinking. But here's the paradox. If consciousness is ultimately embodied in a specific neural event or events, then any explanation of behavior that can be couched in terms of conscious causation can equally well be couched in terms of neural causation. Many acknowledge as much regarding their proposed theory of consciousness, and stating it seems that it would be possible to have a system without qualia that would have the properties we outlined. And this is from Maya and Clearmans. The notion of consciousness becomes superfluous according to this view, and we should thus use terms such as consciousness and attention advisedly in scientific discussions. The alternative view to mental causation, known as epiphenomenalism, is that consciousness is a byproduct of decisions and behaviors. Mental causation implies that when you feel an itch, you scratch it, whereas epiphenomenalism would argue that when you scratch an iterant, you feel an itch. A number of experimental studies have produced evidence that is consistent with epiphenomenalism. Libet, for example, asked participants to make irregular willed finger movements while he recorded electrical potentials from the scalp. Each finger movement was preceded by a brain activation spike called a readiness potential. And again, that's Libet with readiness potential, or RP, which is known to occur prior to voluntary actions. Libet's 1985 participants also viewed a rapidly rotating hand on a clock face and were asked to report the position of the hand at the instant that they were aware of their intention to move their finger. When the timing of the reports was compared to readiness potential times, Libet found that awareness actually followed the RP, or readiness potential, by about 350 milliseconds. So participants only became aware of their intention to act 1/3 of a second after the start of the neural events that triggered the action. In a different procedure by Castiello in 1991, asked participants to manually point to a visual target. Occasionally, the target unexpectedly jumped to a new position after the action had been initiated. Participants could mostly make an appropriate correction to their action, but their awareness of the unexpected jump occurred more than 200 milliseconds after the movement correction. In many activities such as dowsing, divining or divination, and things that happen apparently spontaneously without intentional effort on the part of the participants, of course, that we know is superstitious, of course. But in any ways, Our experience of conscious free will is arguably a post hoc interpretation of the causes of our actions, since free will doesn't exist and everything is determined. However, this epiphenomenalist view begs other questions. If conscious experiences serve no function, why do they exist at all? According to evolutionary theory, traits are retained only if they improve their prospects of survival and reproduction. Of course, this is in evolutionary psychology. And of course, is consciousness adaptive, or it is a spandrel, a byproduct, a simple byproduct of an adaptation, like the umbilical cord? Precisely how do neural events lead to conscious experiences? There's still no universal agreement on what kind of a thing consciousness is, how it can be measured empirically, and how neural events can give rise to that. But of course, these questions, as well as the debate between mental causation and epiphenomenalism, are unlikely to be resolved in the near future, maybe not even in my lifetime in the 21st century.